should we or not green cities? And if yes, how can we ensure that green cities are just? The reason why I'm asking those two kind of provocative questions is because I argue in this talk that the renaturing of large cities is increasingly leading to greater injustice for socially marginalized groups. So despite the ample benefits that greening are bringing, we risk greater injustice for those marginalized residents. Historically, many cities, such as Glasgow, are facing a green divide that is a legacy of environmental goods for some and environmental bads for others. And so, in general, historically marginalized groups, for example, working class residents, racialized areas, or people over 65 living alone, are those living in grayer neighborhoods, that is, more exposed to climate impacts, but also with less access to parks, to nature, to ecological corridors. And on the other hand, you have neighborhoods which are wider and wealthier, which was a greater access to nature, to green space, and are also more protected from climate impacts. So in that sense, you have a green divide. You have the creation of environmental privilege for some and environmental exclusion for others. And neighborhoods which have a higher proportion of immigrants or people of colors are those most greatly exposed to browner areas, because racialized residents have been living in places that have been more greatly disinvested, abandoned, or segregated by law or by practice. And what has happened over the last 10 years or so is that many large cities, and medium-sized cities as well, have engaged in a green mission. That is large-scale investment in green infrastructure, in green space, and in a greater dialogue with residents around the benefits of greening. And so what do you have? You have places like Barcelona, which are greening streets or 3x3 blocks and transforming them into green spaces and pacifying those streets from cars. You have cities such as Dublin, which, through the green strategy, are adding parks to working-class neighborhoods such as the Liberties. You have cities like Nantes, my original country, where the city has managed to double the amount of green spaces by 2 in 25 years and becoming what is known as the city in a garden. And then finally, as here on this picture, you have places like Boston, which is highly exposed to sea level rise and flooding, and where the city has decided to green 70 square kilometers of waterfront and protect residents from flooding. And so in that sense, great investment all over the cities where greening is at the center of urban planning. What cities have also done is increasingly brand themselves as green, meaning that there's a process of green boosterism that my colleague Melissa Garcia-Lamarca is studying, that is the capacity of cities to create a green identity, a green discourse around them, and sell themselves as the most livable place, as the most sustainable place, as the greenest place around the world. Many also, in that case, applying to awards, such as here, the Green Cities Europe Award or the Green Capital Europe Award, which are the series of prizes that cities are winning and that are projecting them on the international arenas. We're talking here about places like Copenhagen, Bristol, but also your own city, Vitoria-Gasteiz. And so this idea here that cities can become more competitive if they brand themselves as green. And how do they do that? Well, basically, they sell the universal benefits of greening for increasing property values, for being great places for investment, for attracting jobs, for increasing sense of community and place attachment, as well as for bringing positive health benefits and ecological benefits for many. So it's a little bit of a Kool-Aid solution, right? Greening is good for every purpose. However, what I argue here is that not all green is good, and not all green is good for everyone. Take the example of the Bosco Verticale in Milan. 2 skyscrapers, 17, 24 floors, facades adorned by 800 trees and 1,500 plants, sold as a marvelous green project for Milan. However, this adorned green facade and the benefits of this greening cannot be offset by the increasing amount of material resources, transport, infrastructure that has been required to bring those green amenities and at the same time to build the building. So there is this image, this green illusion, if you will, that green is good, but it's a mirror, I would argue, in many cases. And on top of it, many of these units, these apartments, are out of reach for the traditional Milan working class or middle class residents. Some of these units are selling for a whopping 7 million euros. And on top of it, those two buildings have created real estate speculation and land use value increases in the surrounding areas, and thus displaced residents. So again, this idea that not green is good, and that green is also accompanied by a form of a green illusion. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about a process that we study in our Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability called green gentrification. That is that greening can be divisive, and there's a divisive access to greening by class, by race, by ethnicity, through a process of removal and segregating residents. And so rather than being a universal benefit for all, it becomes a green LOLO, that is a green locally unwanted land use in our planning language. Not all greening is desirable for everyone because green excludes, green segregates, and green can remove traditionally vulnerable residents, especially those who don't have the means to afford greening. How have we shown that in our research? For example, my colleague Helen Cole shows that in New York City, only the health of wealthier residents and higher educated residents benefits from living in closer proximity to green spaces. So only a special group here, a privileged group, has access to benefits of greening. We also did a broader city study of 28 cities in North America and Western Europe. And what did we find? That in 17 out of those 28 cities, do we find gentrification or green gentrification processes at the citywide scale. So the majority of our cities in our sample have this process taking place. So just let me give you a few examples. In Nantes or in Austin, we see gentrification due to greening occurring over the last decade. Maybe not in the 1990s or 2000, but very recently. We see places like Barcelona, where green gentrification has occurred in a more accelerated way over the last decade, due much of it to the image of Barcelona. We also have places where green gentrification has taken place over the last 20 years in a continued and perseverated fashion, places like Seattle or Atlanta. And we also have places where, if you think about what creates gentrification, that is the displacement of socially vulnerable residents replaced by more powerful residents, what do you see? You see that places such as Copenhagen or Amsterdam or Vancouver are those where greening explains gentrification the most, among other criteria. So again, gentrification is about also the greening that is accompanying a process of displacing residents. What allows, basically, what is the dynamics that allows for this process to take place? We're calling here the phenomenon of the green gap. That is, the fact that neighborhoods which have historically been browner, have been industrialized, have had a lot of vacant land, have a gap in rent, in value, in benefits that can be extracted from them, and that developers, real estate investors, banks, real estate agents are grabbing. They are able to see the value that greening can give them. For example, you can get a loan, a mortgage better if you have greened your building or if you are locating your building next to a green area. You are able to market your property at higher prices, at higher rents, if you green your property or if you are, again, surrounded by greening. So there is an ability by these elite stakeholders to extract value from greening and make it just for a few. And what allows this to take place is the fact that many cities do not have the means to really control real estate development. They are dependent on development for tax purposes, for jobs, for revenues of many sorts that can then feed into their budget. And many of them would like to do more. They would like to not only prioritize gray areas, but to say, okay, we put equity first. But many of them feel caught in that dynamic of green grab and that dependence on these types of investment and jobs. What does the life of green gentrification look like? Well, if you take a place like East Boston, in the city of Boston, it's a neighborhood that has historically been inhabited by working-class Italian, Latino residents, Latinx residents, and is now increasingly gentrified, and where gentrified residents are being pushed away to browner neighborhoods, to more climate-exposed neighborhoods, and at the same time, those who benefit from a restored waterfront, from resilient shorelines, from new parks and greenways, are wealthier newcomers who can afford $2,000, 2,000 euro studios or one-bedroom units, who are the ones who come by boat shuttle and sip a $15 cocktail or consume a $40 entree. And so this is a privileged class that lives there. And then you also see residents telling you that it's not the neighborhood where they used to be anymore, that there's a sense that they are not connected anymore to the waterfront to the level that they would like to be connected. They are a coastal community, but they feel that their land is being colonized. My colleague calls this a disruptive green landscape, Margarita Trigueros-Mas. That is a form of landscape that, even though it's been restored, even though it's been green, is being disrupted for socially vulnerable groups. Some quotes from residents also illustrate that dynamic. For example, in Montreal, residents tell you, we feel that the park is being more patrolled now. This is not a space where we can find a healthy mix of people. In Dublin, residents say, we feel a greater sense of isolation, a greater sense of anger, because we feel pushed out. Or in places like Washington, D.C., when the park is finished, we will not be there to enjoy it. We will be good enough to serve you Slurpees at the River Festival, but not to live there. What are alternatives to divisive or divided green cities? Well, in our lab, we believe in a series of policy and planning tools that can guarantee urban green justice. And here what we can think about is, on the one hand, anti-gentrification and anti-displacement tools, and on the other hand, a way to make greening more inclusive and more open. Anti-gentrification tools, for example, rent control or rent decreases, such as places like Berlin. Places such as property tax freezes, where working-class residents who are in a gentrified neighborhood do not have to pay as much property taxes, like in Philadelphia. Land bank, inclusionary zoning to a very high level, that is that at least half of your units being built need to be reserved for social or public housing, like in Nantes. And then also have neighborhood development schemes, that is, a way in which land is being controlled by the community and is being managed by residents who are organized into cooperatives, such as community land trusts, like in Boston. In Portland, we find cooperatives like Living Cully, which are taking in their own hands both the climate resilient work that their neighborhood needs, but also the construction of affordable housing. That is the ability to bring social and environmental together. We also have a process that we can see in many cities called green reparations. That is for racialized residents, groups that have been removed from their neighborhoods that have been gentrified, being the ones with a greater priority to come back to a neighborhood that has been rebuilt and that has been green. In Portland, Oregon, there is also a policy of right to return, right to place for residents. And then we also see the organization of community residents for greater ecological resilience, for greater takeover of coastal environments and ecosystems, so that residents can enjoy the waterfronts. They can be the one enjoying renewed areas. The work of Boston Harbor Keepers or Eastie Farms in Boston really shows how residents can also mobilize to claim greening for themselves. In sum, just to clarify, urban greening has many ecological, human health, and other social benefits. That is undeniable, and cities need to continue greening. However, we need to move beyond the idea that green is good for everyone and that we can green in any possible way, so that we can really put equity at the center of urban greening. Thank you.